Hello friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we want to talk about this full moon eclipse that's coming up not too long from now. And just eclipse season in general. The Gemini focus of this eclipse season is very interesting when we consider that also Mercury is going to be retrograding through Gemini. So it's a pretty powerful time. In terms of what? In terms of our thought process, in terms of how we communicate, in terms of how we dream the future into being, in terms of how we visualize the world around us. That's part of the whole third and ninth house axis, ninth house higher mind, belief systems, worldview. And the opposite is, of course, the third, which is where we're going to be seeing the whole axis with this full moon at the 5-degree mark of Gemini and Sagittarius, and then the new moon eclipse that follows a couple of weeks later, which would be June 10th, is still going to be in Gemini, so that still focalizes the entire ninth and third house axis. Gives us something to think about, is one way to look at it. What we'll be thinking about is really our thought process itself. How do we do this? How do we figure it out? How do we see what we're up to? And how do we take into account also unconscious process, which is a very big part of our psyche, our entire psyche, you could say. So let's go and look at the chart. And you should be able to see it now. Here's the lunar eclipse. And give you a clue that the eclipse is an eclipse because of the proximity to the north node with the sun and the south node with the moon, of course. They're always opposite the nodal axis. And when the nodal axis actually represents the point where the moon's orbit intersects with the Earth's plane, with the plane of the ecliptic, the Earth with the sun. So when, just as the moon reaches that point in its orbit, we do have an eclipse because they're all lined up. The sun, the moon, and the Earth are all lined up on the same plane, just because it's reached that point where the ascending node, which is actually where the sun is, or the descending node, which is where the moon is, it's about to go. The moon is diving below the Earth's plane of the ecliptic, as it moves through Sagittarius at the end of the month here. So what can we get out of this? We want to look also at where things are. I think most interestingly, really, to tell you the truth, I find right now, is Mercury. And Mercury is very innocuous looking in this configuration. But on the other hand, we have to realize that this is the degree of its station. So Mercury stations 3 days later on the 29th. At 24 degrees of Gemini and about 3/4, so about a half a degree further it will go into Gemini as it's slowing down. So it's already going quite slowly. People say they feel the retrograde already, even now, which is another few days before this actual configuration. And I think it's going to be a very interesting retrograde time period. For one reason, Saturn and Uranus are also involved. So, as we have been talking about beforehand, about this time period, this whole month of May and June, Saturn has reached its retrograde moment. So, just a couple of days before this eclipse, Saturn stopped dead still in the sky around 13.5 degrees of Aquarius, which gives the Taurus presence of Uranus a little chance to catch up to it, you see, because now it's not, Saturn that is not moving forward anymore. In fact, it's moving backward, starting to move backwards. Just right now it's hanging there still in the sky. And meanwhile, Uranus keeps going. So Uranus will eventually get to 14 degrees by August, which is where it retrogrades. But you can see that, in the next, as it turns out, even before you get to 1 month away, Uranus will cross that 13.5 degree mark. So, let's see, maybe I can show you that. So if we look at a window that has the Capricorn full moon in it, which is not an eclipse, which is coming up on June 24th, you can see that at that point, Uranus has reached, a month later, 13.5 degrees. And of course, meanwhile, Saturn has moved backwards a little bit more. So sometime in the middle of that period, like a couple of weeks into this 30-day period between the 26th of May and the 24th of June, which is what I'm looking at here, there will be that exact hit. Now, astrologers talk about the exact hit. You'll see it in the write-ups. They say, oh, Saturn is perfectly square to Uranus at this moment, but we really have to take the whole period into account, the whole timing of this. And the fact of the matter is, I'm sorry, wrong window there. This really is, right now, the timing, because, it's a degree and a half away, but they're moving toward each other. And a couple of weeks from now, a couple of weeks from this point, from the May 26th point, there will be that exact hit, but the whole time they're getting closer, and it's not like you cannot see it in the zeitgeist, right? We have such a division between conservative and progressive forces right now. Including the Israeli conflict with Hamas, which is conservative, you see, to try to keep the status quo, and the progressives being the Palestinians trying to see how they can get a different deal. They'd like to have their own territory, their own country, instead of being kind of subject to the Israeli state, is the argument in favor of that. On the other hand, they're the first ones that threw the rockets because they got so frustrated and they're trying to make waves, and every once in a while these conflicts rise up, and in this case, it did start with the people in Gaza throwing rockets, and of course, Israel responds really. Anyway, you can see that there's a conflict between conservative and progressive that's really highlighted there in terms of violence. And we see it in this country, too, with the two parties, because the Democrats have been getting more progressive. There is a more progressive electorate that brought them into power. People say that Biden is moving to the left. He's becoming so progressive. And then other people say, which I think is quite accurate, that he just is very good weather vane for where the people are at and where the Democrats are at. And there is a huge progressive part of the Democratic electorate. And of course, on the other hand, the Republicans are responding to the conservative electorate that kind of wants to keep things a little bit more buttoned down the way they were. Let's not change things too fast. So these are the dynamics. We could say also that with Saturn conservative and Uranus progressive, having this little war with each other, which is actually getting stronger over the next month, as I was trying to show you, we could say that there's also within each one of us a conservative and a progressive element, and we really need them both. There's no question that we have to look forward, that we have to try to change what doesn't work in our own lives, that we are ready to let go of certain things that maybe we've been ready for a long time to let go of, but maybe is only now coming to a head. So we have a more thoughtful viewpoint with all this Mercury taking place. We are looking into the situation with ourselves, things we're thinking about, things we are triggered intuitionally as well to think about, because remember, Uranus is the planet of intuition. Uranus in Taurus speaks to, within the human body, within the physical situation that we have in our 3D reality of this physical plane, there is another track, you might say, that runs in an orthogonal direction, a vertical track that takes us out of this dimension into other dimensions of reality, other dimensions of realization. And of course, really it is the depths of the psyche, the unconscious part of the psyche that we're talking about, that Jung was so good about beginning to elucidate. So Uranus really represents that. Having it triggered in this way with the Saturn does bring it out. And so there's a lot going on with that. And we might remember also, oops, let's do what we want. Okay. So we might remember also that the new moon that took place before this full moon, so this is the full moon of the new moon cycle that began at 21 degrees of Taurus. Well, that was in aspect to Neptune, sextile to Neptune. And when we get to the next new moon, which will be June 10th, and also an eclipse, let's just look at that for a second. So here is the following new moon, which is a couple of weeks later, right? and this will be also an eclipse, a solar eclipse, and this will be at 19 degrees and 47 minutes of Gemini. So that's a square. I mean, it's not quite as close because there's about a 4-degree difference, well, 3.5. And yet, on the other hand, it is square to Neptune. So I think we really do need to think about, as we go into this June month, a couple of things relating to how we do things, how we see things. And that, there's a lot of Gemini, that there's going to be Mercury retrograding back to the 16-degree mark in Gemini starting by the end of this month. I didn't mention, but that new moon, which is June 10th, is actually conjunct also to Mercury, and they're very close together. Less than a degree, moving toward each other. The sun and moon moving forward in Gemini. Mercury just sitting there, not going forward, but rather going backward, and about to station on the 22nd of June, I believe it is. At that moment, we do not see a cessation of the retrograde period. We see one peak of the retrograde period, because it does take a while before Mercury, having turned around, really picks up speed again, and also transverses the Gemini degrees, the 8 degrees of Gemini that it moved backward through. That zodiacal part of Gemini that it already went backwards through. It goes through 3 times, really, the first time now, but then retrograde, then forward again. And then we say when it gets finally to the 24-degree mark where it started, is when it really kind of completely settles down. So that means the entire month of June coming up is a month of retrograde Mercury. And it's particularly strong because it's retrograde in Gemini, its own sign. So we're going to be thinking about, as I say, our thought process itself. We're going to be trying to balance the idea of how much of our thought process on the conscious level really addresses the issues that we have, or are there nagging feelings that we can really pin down as there's intuitional. We have to pay attention to intuition. We don't want to leave our unconscious part of ourselves behind, because that's really contributing to where we're at. And we can get our clue from that. Sometimes your intuition can be very powerful, tell you exactly what's going on, but you have to learn to pay attention to it. So those kind of things will be coming up with Mercury retrograde, and with the fact that as Mercury gets to its station on June 22nd, it'll be at 16 degrees. That will be pretty close trine to the 12-degree mark at that point of Saturn. So that the fact that Mercury stations in trine to Saturn makes it even stronger. And we will have a very powerful, I believe, Mercury retrograde period coming up following this eclipse as part of this whole eclipse season, which includes this full moon and then the full moon that I showed before, and then the coming new moon on June 10th. And that will be, like I say, an entire cycle. This is a Gemini cycle beginning here on June 10th, lasting for 30 days. And basically, we will be in the Mercury, in the Mercury retrograde for that whole time until the first week of July, when it finally gets to 24 degrees of Gemini again, and therefore straightens out. So I think it's going to be quite a cycle coming up with this beginning with this full moon, really, and the retrograde of Mercury 3 days later. So we are going to be seeing quite a lot of opportunity, I believe, to look deeply within ourselves. And remember, Pluto's still active. We tend to forget about Pluto because it was the Saturn-Pluto all 2020. That was really the science signature of the COVID. The societal reset that was predicted by astrologers before even January 2020, when it became more obvious that there was something else going on with this pandemic, which we have all suffered through all this time. And one thing about the pandemic, a year ago, when we were heading into the summer of 2020, I was noticing a very strong configuration, which I can point out to you in this very eclipse chart, because it's still happening. So we had Saturn and Pluto together, and by the end of the year, we had Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter together. This is the end of 2020. But for the summer of 2020, I noticed also that this T-square was here between Eris, very strongly configured planet. Everything it touches in the chart becomes magnified. It's definitely a very important factor in chart analysis, including what you might call the world transits, the mundane chart of the moment. Now, it was opposite at that time, last summer, to Haumea, and that's reforming, because here's Haumea 27 now, so really less than 3 degrees away from a perfect opposition. And when Haumea crosses into the 26 degree mark, it will be partile square to the Pluto. So this is still pretty powerful, even without Saturn in the picture. So I believe that this T-square has a lot to tell us about the summer, which is when they get closer and closer, you see, because that's when Haumea really gets into a very close opposition with Eris. And I'm actually wondering, I hate to say this, but I'm wondering if the pandemic might not be ready to give up. The indications for that in the real world are that there's a terrible epidemic going on in India right now. And I think other places in the world. And the question I ask is, well, if we give up all of our protections here in this country and we say, well, we can just open up then because we have a good vaccine rate and there's a low incidence and, there's no hospitalizations right now in San Francisco, which is great. All those are positive indications, but I think we still need to be cautious. I think we still need to do social distancing because we don't have any way to know whether somebody's been vaccinated or not. There is a good percentage of the population that's vaccinated, but the other thing that's keeping us safe here in California is the social distancing. So I'm kind of wondering if they may be pushing it a little too fast, too far, because there is that temptation, right, to have the economy be better and open up and have, bars be able to finally collect some profit from more than 50% of occupancy and so on, restaurants. I mean, there's so many businesses that depend on behaviors that we haven't been able, including concert, of course, music and performances. So I know the temptation is there to relax, and I wonder if it's too fast. And I wonder if it's really true that we are in a bubble that is completely separate from other parts of the world, such as India, even though it's such a far distance away. They're already seeing this new variant that's taking over in India that's being very deadly. They're seeing, and they probably will respond to the vaccine. And I'm not saying it won't respond to the vaccine, but I don't think they know about that for sure, but I think the likelihood is that the variants seem to be responding to the vaccine. But there's been 3 in different countries of Europe cases, several cases in Germany and Norway, I think. So, I wonder how long it's going to be possible for that COVID variant. I mean, we don't have that great of a behavior set up, with masking and all that in this country. And so that's the physical evidence. If I was commentating as just a journalist. But on the other hand, speaking of just in terms of the astrology, I do see this configuration coming back this summer, and I know that it means that there's a societal situation coming up. And gosh, we see that. We do see that in the reason I brought Neptune to the fore. There's all this question mark of what is the real, what is the real truth here, People kind of trying to duck the responsibility for what happened on June 6th. Was that an insurrection, or was that just kind of a reflex of crowd upset? A lot of it came from, the lie that the election was stolen, which was a lie. Everybody knows that. Even the politicians on the Republican side know that. But then the question is, why do they keep saying it? Why do you see some Republican politicians continue to say the election was stolen, it was fraudulent? Why does 67% of the Republican voters, the Republican base, why do they feel that the possibility is that Biden is not a legitimate president, was not legitimately elected in a fair and clear election, where it was one of the fairest and clearest elections and the biggest turnout in history? And many have talked about how clear it was that the election had no fraud. And there was 60 lawsuits. They couldn't find the evidence. No evidence was ever put forward that there was any fraud. But yet the one word of at one point the sitting president of the United States, the stolen election, that has become cause celeb amongst right-wing politicians and voters that there was a problem and that maybe Biden was not legitimate. So I don't want to get into politics. I'm sorry, I apologize for doing that, but I'm just wanting to say that with or without a COVID resurge this summer, as I'm saying, may be happening with this configuration, this T-square that gets stronger over the summer, it is true that we have really a lot to deal with in this country in terms of the whole society, in terms of what aspects of the society we want to promote and what aspects we want to kind of start to tone down, including the very vast and crucial and pressing issue of climate change, which involves fossil fuels, which involves profits from fossil fuel companies, which involves the whole principle of extraction. You know, to my mind, we should be not taking any oil out of the ground whatsoever, just stop. And we'd have a lot of gas shortages. And that would be terrible. You know, people would be without gasoline. They wouldn't be able to drive as much. But, you know, and the economy would suffer. But on the other hand, what are we going to suffer 10 years from now? The way it looks, the way the sea level rise and the likelihood of greater storms and greater droughts and greater fire problems in California. So I really think that it should be more drastic than not drastic. Myself, that's my position, my opinion, but it is what the science tells us also. And meanwhile, there's a lot of people trying to push back on that. So we do have, you know, either way, a fairly dire situation, a fairly difficult societal situation where we're trying to transform our society in ways that would be beneficial to all members. And we're also fighting a backlash against that. Is it really going to happen? Or, you know, do we want to keep things the way they are? We don't want to move too fast, too far. We don't want things to get too strange. I myself am in favor of diversity. I think it really brings new life to the situation to have more and more diverse opinions, but that's me. So I don't want to get into politics, like I say, but I do see this T-square as very important. These planets are powerful factors. Even though they're new, they're just beyond Pluto. In the Kuiper Belt, declared officially as planets in 2006 and 2008 by the International Astronomical Union. I've already written and talked a lot about, and Uranus is beginning to be recognized as a very important chart factor, which I call a feminine warrior in support of soul intention, rising to the best that you have within you and seeing what it is that only you can fully articulate as your position. In other words, come to your own point of view and the way you see things. And I see this as part of the whole pandemic situation, which has been going on for a year and a half, because really each individual has to contribute so that we can get through it. In other words, if it isn't every individual behavior aligned with the idea of not spreading the virus, then we have problems, which we've been seeing. Now, interestingly, Haumea has to do with a profound connection to nature, which also involves aspects of natural law. So there's a kind of a moral compass inherent in the position of Haumea, which I think is also a huge factor in our current zeitgeist. In other words, the corporations can't be responsible to government because they can always find a way around it, and the government doesn't always do the right thing there either. It's up to each individual, again, to have a moral responsibility to do the right thing, to not pollute, to do things that are to the benefit of society instead of just to make a buck, whether it benefits society or not. And we see this in all kinds of different ways, which I won't go into, but you know that that's what's happening, that there's a very fundamental process going on. You could call it the age of Aquarius, where we're trying to see how we can live on this earth in a way that's gentle, that treats all the creatures of the earth as our allies and as our, we have the brains, but they have their own way. And there's a way that we're all part of the functioning of the earth as an ecosystem, as a biosystem. So, I'm getting very preachy here. I apologize for that too. But I think they're very good factors, very important factors in the transformation of society that we're seeing as reflected in Pluto and Capricorn, namely the very evolution of Capricorn refers to the society around us. So we're seeing, and of course, then we have the Saturn in Aquarius too. The beginning of Aquarius, first degree of Aquarius, was the Saturn-Jupiter from December 21st, which was hailed by many astrologers as the beginning of something, a big shift in the way we see the society. So we are seeing societal changes. We're seeing how that comes back to each one of us to make our own changes, not necessarily along the same lines, but we have our own burden to bear. We have our own transformation that we have to undergo, and that's the process of maturation, the process of living. So with Pluto, you always want to think about what has to be left behind, what has to die in order that the entire organism can flourish and be reborn. And that's the process that we're all in the midst of, and that we're all in a very thoughtful orientation towards with these, as I say, these Gemini and Sagittarius eclipse energies that are coming on us this month. So it's going to be a very thoughtful month, a month of really taking stock, thinking about where you're at, where you want to be at, where you want to go, how you can be both conservative of your powers and of your existing situation, and yet also progressive enough to allow change to take place and the transformation to take place that we all really need to be part of. We need to understand how we can kind of go along with the necessary change that we can see ourselves, for ourselves. And I think that's what's up. So good luck with this. It's going to be very interesting to see how this Mercury Retrograde plays out. As I say, I think it's a very powerful Mercury Retrograde that we're coming to for this entire coming month of June. And I will be able to talk to you soon when we have another session. Try to make it in a couple of weeks. And that's it for now. So enjoy, and don't take it too hard, but take it seriously. Thanks. Bye now.